I'm here with Jeremy Wimpy from Applied Trails Research. He's going to lead us off into our last presentation for the day. And then at the end, we'll have a few concluding remarks and logistics for tomorrow. So Jeremy, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Randy. And thank you all for attending here on the last session of the day here on Wednesday. As Randy said, we've got Nathan Rigner is going to be convening this panel. It's Indigenous Wilderness Stewardship from Time Immemorial to Tomorrow. And with that, Nathan, I'm going to let you get us started, and we'll keep an eye on time and questions for y'all.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. So thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it very much. My name is Nathan Rigner. I'm with Penn State in the Recreation Park and Tourism Management program. That's all you need to know about me. This panel is not about me. It focuses on our panelists. I do want to take a moment here in the beginning before we jump in to share a couple of initial thoughts. One, why have we come together to have this panel? Well, I think we've come together. I'm sure we all have our own reasons for that, and I hope that our discussion today covers those reasons. But I do think that there is a growing recognition that among the many good things that wilderness is and does, it is also the product of colonial processes, institutions, and mindsets. That the benefits gained from Western or science-based administration of wilderness are also accompanied by a disenfranchisement of indigenous and local populations, disconnection from integrated social and environmental systems, and interruption, or in some cases, in fact, termination of resource stewardship systems and legacies that were in place long before the establishment of wilderness. And so we're here together today looking for ways forward to reconcile this situation, to enrich wilderness and wilderness management by decolonizing it and reconnecting it with indigenous and traditional ways to improve the lives and land for all of us. And so big picture, that is what I think we're doing here, or that's what I hope we can make progress on that. And I hope we can all join in that. To begin our conversation, I do want to share with you some thoughts about guide words and guidelines for our conversation today. I got some of this material from the University of Minnesota's Extension Service. I liked it, and so I borrowed it. And so in our conversation, I have these guide words. We have these guide words, things to focus on, like being constructive and being open and understanding, being kind to each other while also challenging each other, being compassionate, being co-productive, doing this together, and understanding that this is an iterative conversation that we're going to have, not one and done. I'd also like us as a group to be very participatory in this. The bulk of our panel is going to be organized around discussion. And so during that, please do share your questions and your comments, but also understand this as a discussion, not a debate. So we are not seeking victory, we are seeking exploration. Please do participate. I hope that there's room in this conversation. Well, I know that there's room for everyone in this conversation, and I hope we all choose to pick up that opportunity and take advantage of it. Please share. Please share when you're asking a question or making a comment who you are, where you come from, what affiliations you hold. I think it's always good to know, to have words not be disembodied, but be connected to who we are and where we're coming from. Please listen and speak with respect to others and their points of view. That's pretty golden rule there. Do your best to understand the pros and cons of everybody's opinion. Be charitable with your ears and your voice. And please, this last one I think is is something I, as a professor standing in front of a room of students, often need to reflect on a little bit more, to seek to understand rather than be understood. So with these as our guideline, as our guide words and guidelines, I'll give you just a little overview about the rhythm of our panel today. So we have our opening piece, where we're setting the stage, and check the box on that. That's what we just did. Now, in this next portion of things, each of our three panelists will share with us some opening comments, some initial thoughts, put some ideas out on the table to get us started. That'll be maybe 15 minutes or so of our conversation coming up. Following that, we'll enter into the discussion period of things. I have a few questions to get our panelists started, but I think our time would be better spent engaging with everybody attending this panel. And so during that period of things, one, please put your questions and comments into the question and answer box. Jeremy and the other co-hosts will help me take a look at that and get as many of those questions entered into our dialogue as possible. And I would encourage our panelists to speak with each other. I'm sure that we all have different thoughts about these topics, and a little counterpoint, a little will you tell me more about that, I think will go a long way towards helping us explore the corners of this topic. And then after, as our discussion wraps up, about at the top of the hour, maybe a few minutes past, we'd like to have each of our panelists again take an opportunity to make a closing statement, to summarize their thoughts, to reiterate a key point that they'd like to share with us, and that'll be our program for today. That'll be this round of this conversation, one of many more I hope we have together. So, with that as our orientation, join me in a round of applause welcoming our panelists. And we're going to start off opening statements with Teresa Martinez. So, Teresa, may I read your biography? Okay, great. Teresa Martinez. For over 30 years, Teresa has worked professionally to increase awareness, engagement, access, and stewardship of our entire national trail system. A graduate of Virginia Tech, go Hokies, she holds a BS and MS from the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife and the College of Natural Resources. Teresa is an outdoor recreationist who has worked for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the Continental Divide Trail Alliance, and since 2012, she's been executive director of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, which she co-founded. She serves on the Trail Leadership Council for the Partnership for National Scenic Trails, for the Partnership for the National Trail System, on the Trail Leadership Council. She serves on the Trail Leadership Council for the Partnership for the National Trail System and has served as the chair of the Federal Advisory Committee to aid the U.S. Forest Service in development of the Pacific Northwest National Scenic Trail. Teresa is actively involved in the creation of equitable spaces for all people in the outdoors, and currently serves as the acting chair of the board of the Next 100 Coalition. And Teresa, will you take a moment to tell us about that in your opening statements? In 2019, Teresa was honored by Virginia Tech College of Natural Resources as the recipient of the Gerald Cross Alumni Leadership Award. Thank you very much for joining us, Teresa. We look very much forward to what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you. It's a mouthful when you talk about the Partnership for the National Trail System. Even I have a hard time. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Teresa Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. I am also now actually the official chair of the Next 100 Coalition, which I'll talk briefly about shortly. But I do want to just first mention that I am coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, which are the homelands of the Hickory, Apache, and Tewa people. And I want to acknowledge that I am not Indigenous. And in this conversation, it's important to acknowledge that that when we are not representative of the communities that we are talking about, I don't want to necessarily center on my work. I want to make sure that my conversation is centered on the people that we're actually talking about, which is Indigenous and Native peoples. Having said that, I want to share just real briefly that at the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, we've taken a really different approach to how we manage the National Scenic Trails. First of all, we recognize that the CDT itself is more than an 18 to 24-inch tread. It's a connector of communities, cultures, landscapes that happens to span 3,100 miles along the Continental Divide. And the Continental Divide itself is the major watershed of the North American continent, kind of a big deal, and it provides water to over 180 million people, but it's also a migration corridor of wildlife and humans and the holder of our history, traditions, connections, and communities. At CDTC, we always take a moment to acknowledge that the CDT traverses across its entire span stolen lands, and that it's important for us as an organization and as a community to recognize that many of the traditional stewards of these places that have called them home for time memorial and still call them home today. It's not a past, it's a present and as a future. Were persecuted and killed through genocide and forced removal from these places, and yet they're still thriving in these places and have a strong connection to these lands. So we try to honor these people, past, present, and again, in the future, and all Indigenous peoples who've inhabited, held sacred, and stewarded the land along the Continental Divide, and not just the trail. And we do that because we want to recognize and with gratitude and appreciation for their long history connected to these landscapes. I'll stop there with CDTC because I want to get to questions, but I will also mention that as my role with the Next 100 Coalition, and I'm not sure if anyone from Next 100 is listening today, but we are a coalition of organizations and individuals who represent the communities that look like us. So it's Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian communities who are also involved in natural resources in many different ways, whether that's in policy or actively getting people outdoors. And we formed in 2016, and now just starting to get our legs under us. We're getting ready to launch an executive director search, in fact, here in the next month, to really help lead within our communities and also be our own voices. Instead of letting other people center our voices, we're going to center our own in this space of outdoor recreation, connecting all people to our places, our nation's incredible parks, trails, forests, watersheds, natural places, special places, monuments, you name it, but that we're representing ourselves and having our own voice. And so we do everything from workforce pipeline planning and working with the agencies and helping them understand how they can create a more equitable and just culture within their agencies, to literally just meeting with the Biden administration and helping them understand what does it actually mean when you say we're going to be just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive in our work. So we are just getting started, and I'll leave it there, but thank you for having me, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We do too, and appreciate it. Okay, our next panelist for introduction, Sarah, you ready? Okay, Sarah Hoagland is a research biologist for the U.S. Forest Service and currently serves as the Tribal Liaison Officer for the Rocky Mountain region of the U.S. National Forest System. Sarah's research begins with the recognition that forests in the American West have departed from historical conditions due to the effects of the other kind of Western management, including fire suppression, timber harvesting, livestock grazing, and others. Through her work, she strives to incorporate tribal information to understand and assess forest conditions and processes, and to educate and inform forest practitioners about the applicability of traditional ecological knowledge in natural resource management. And Sarah, maybe at some point you can define for us, or at least give us some ideas about what traditional ecological knowledge is. Sarah is a member of Laguna Pueblo and holds a PhD in forestry from Northern Arizona University. Thank you, Sarah. Please.
Yeah. That was such a kind bio. I can't believe that. Thank you so much, Nathan. I really appreciate that. Boy, you summed up a lot of stuff there. So thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers for coordinating this. And just happy to be on this panel with the two other outstanding individuals. And then also want to say thanks to Teresa. I appreciated that land acknowledgement because, as Nathan just mentioned, my family's from the Pueblo of Laguna, just southwest of you. So we hold great connections to that place, and I'm glad that you started with that. So thank you. So I'm calling in from Missoula, Montana. I work at the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. So I'm calling in from the homelands of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, the Blackfeet, even the Yakima and the Nez Perce spent time in this area. But as Nathan mentioned, and as we were talking about earlier, a lot of my research is mainly in southwestern dry forests, primarily in New Mexico. But as far as sort of opening comments here, again, I'm primarily speaking, I have to kind of wear this dual hat, right? As a Native person, but then also as sort of a federal employee. And so I have this constant, like, two different worldviews that I'm walking, but mainly today I'd like to talk about sort of that federal perspective and coming from like an agency research and development perspective. But some of the things I thought of just for how we can make room for tribal voices in some of these spaces regarding wilderness stewardship and management. The first thing I thought of, and I have 4 quick points to make. One is I really think that we need to, just from a research and publication standpoint, a lot of our journals are lacking associate editors that can even evaluate articles that include things like traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous research methodologies, things like that. Our journals and our publications are struggling just to review incoming potential publications that include things like that. So I think just from sort of a peer-reviewed literature standpoint, we just are kind of lacking some of that workforce. And then the second point I wanted to make was, and this kind of goes to my role there at the tribal college where I'm working a lot with Native students and sort of recruiting the next generation of Native scholars, is we really need to have more Indigenous people as decision makers and as leaders. Hopefully some of you were listening to the White House, the first or the most recent summit for tribal nations yesterday. And in that presentation, they focused a lot on Indian education. And I think that ties greatly into promoting more Native leaders. But one of the sad statistics I heard on there is that only 17% of American Indian college, 17% of American Indian high school graduates go on to college, versus 62% of Caucasian students graduating high school go on to college. And so there's huge disparities.
Will you give us that number again?
17% versus 62%. And so this goes back to this, a big piece on falling on Indian education. And we could probably talk about this for a whole week-long seminar, but I think part of getting us to promoting more Indians in positions of leadership relies on this education piece. So the third point I wanted to make, again, about sort of creating more space for tribal voices is we need to do a better job on all sides of the equation on increased relationship building. And I think it comes down to just having more empathy, having more understanding, having more just sort of like good classic dialogue, like kind of like what we're having today, where we can create some of those respectful spaces for cross-cultural communication. But that relationship building piece, I think, is also key. The last thing I'll mention too is making room for tribal voices. One thing that we notice within the realm of like wildlife conservation and wildlife management is there's a huge gap in the literature as far as just covering what's going on in Indian country and how tribes are actually managing their wilderness areas, their wildlife, their forests, and all that stuff. And so we actually just recently submitted the full manuscript for a new publication that's coming out on tribal wildlife management, recognizing that there was this gap in the literature. So there's a new volume that's coming out that will have, I think we have a total of 36 contributions throughout Indian country talking about how they are managing their wildlife. And so I think that there are spaces for us to kind of keep finding those gaps and filling some of that. But with that, that sort of hits my opening comments. But again, I'm happy to be here today. Thank you so much for the space and really looking forward to the rest of the conversation as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And if you're able to, at some point during our conversation today, put any information in the chat about how we can find that manuscript once it becomes publicly available, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, excellent. Our third panelist, okay. Chali Faismere. Chali is a graduate student at Arizona State University pursuing her PhD in biology. She focuses on ecosystem management impacts of legal and administrative boundaries on federal lands. She's interested in science outreach and education, natural resource use and law, land management and collaborations for the management of ecosystems, and migrating anthropogenic impacts and mitigating anthropogenic impacts on ecosystems. Put my glasses on. Thank you very much, Charlie. Please tell us where your mind is right now.
Thank you for that intro. I think you said mind reading, which I wish I had that talent. And I wanted to share too that I am also, I'm not an Indigenous, sorry, I'm gonna trip over my words today, Indigenous person. I have a knowledge base that I hope I can use to bolster Indigenous voices and initiatives. So what I want to talk about and where I fall into this is the history piece. And, you know, when we think of wilderness and history, I think a lot of us think of areas that are saved from development and that we have a connection to and that we think of as pristine and untouched, but usually are not pristine and are almost never untouched. I mean, there have always been people on this landscapes, and unfortunately, the way that the Wilderness Act has been written, it removes the people from those landscapes. So this is an issue of colonialist language as I see it. The Wilderness Act is caught up in this language in that it speaks of a man who is a visitor who will not remain, which I believe somebody brought up in the coffee hour this morning. And, you know, this is a piece that we've had a problem with as, you know, an American people for a while now. And there's no, you know, we can't go back. We can't open up the act easily and fix this sort of thing. So we have to find ways that we can incorporate Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous voices on these lands that they have interacted with for thousands of years. And while, you know, the writers did have good intentions, this has happened. I want to look at two quick examples of how this is played out for two different areas. The first one is the Timbisha Shoshone, and they were living in what is now the National Monument, or the Death Valley National Park. It was given National Monument status in the 30s. And they managed to stay on this land by just not leaving. But their summer area, Wild Rose Canyon, was designated wilderness, and they lost access to that because it was only held for recreational purposes and they weren't allowed to live there. This caused a lot of troubles for the tribe and eventually resolved many years later. It was 2000, so 1930, the National Monument was declared. 2000, there was an agreement called the Timbisha Shoshone Homeland Act, in which they gained back some of their land, but also they were given rights to designated special use areas in which tribal members are authorized to pursue low impact, ecologically sustainable traditional practices under a management plan mutually agreed upon by the tribe and the National Park Service. In a second quick example, I want to talk about the Taos Pueblo and Blue Lake real quick. So in 1903, 48,000 acres were temporarily withdrawn from the Taos Pueblo. And this is in northeastern New Mexico. If I have that wrong, Teresa, please correct me. In 1906, that was permanently declared a national forest. The Blue Lake area was sacred to the Taos Pueblo, but there were trails that were cleared to this area, and non-native trout were stocked for fishing. Dynamite fishing was a big thing. And so they started to fight in the 60s to get their land back, to get specifically Blue Lake back. And part of what was discussed was Udall came to them and said, what if we made it wilderness? And they said, you know, that's not a bad proposal. It's not a bad plan, but it doesn't work because they can't guarantee their cultural future without some sort of say in that land. So in the 70s, they did have their land returned to them. So the point of these two examples is that while wilderness does a really good job protecting landscapes, it does have issues because it does not, in fact, acknowledge that these landscapes have been modified by people before settlers arrived in the US. and modified in large ways. I mean, Indigenous people used fire to cultivate the landscape. They grazed animals. They used areas for agricultural purposes. And the wording of the act continues to act as colonizing language by denying the history of these people. So, going forward, how do we reincorporate these people on the landscape? And at a larger scale, how do we reincorporate all of us onto the landscape? Because we are all part of these ecosystems. And by not acknowledging that, we have this adversarial relationship with wilderness that maybe could be resolved through different perspectives brought to us by Indigenous people. And that's my intro.
Yeah, your opening salvo. Excellent. Thank you very much. So I hope that, excuse me, I hope that those initial comments give everyone here a sense of who our panelists are and where they're coming from, maybe what some of their priorities are. Questions are beginning to come in the Q&A, and that's fantastic. While those of us who are managing this wrap our minds around those, let's throw this one out for all of our panelists to take a bite from. Why is recognizing the colonial legacy and presence of wilderness and wildlands important?
Well, I'll start off only because I want to share too that, I'm very privileged that I get to work with the Continental Divide National Scenic Trail, which is a congressionally designated resource that is in fact a corridor of land between Mexico and Canada. And so I also want to share that while we're talking about wilderness and wildlands, this is all lands in our country, right? And I think sometimes we get caught up in something with a capital W and little w and what's wild and what isn't wild. And I think we need to think beyond those boundaries. Those are just art kind of, I think this is part of that question around Indigenousness and thinking about how people look at land and their connection. There's, boundaries are very arbitrary and artificial. And just because there's a line that says this is wilderness and this isn't, doesn't make that land any less sacred, right? So I think there's an important part around in terms of a perspective. So I want to think about two things. One is I think when I think about the Continental Divide Trail and the corridor along it, which is something like 1.98 million acres of land, we recognize that that corridor is very arbitrary, and that while there may be sites that are designated along that archaeologists have said, hey, these are important to tribes, the entire thing is sacred, right? So it's like sacredness doesn't end because an archaeologist says it doesn't have any value scientifically. So I just wanted to state that. So I think from our perspective, one of the things we have to start understanding is how we actually look at lands and decolonize our own language and decolonize our own selves, and how we see ourselves in relationship to these places, and that, it isn't just a recreational space. It isn't just a place to go experience wilderness. All natural places have some value that sometimes we don't have a conventional way of looking at it in today's conservation language and our wilderness preservation language, and how we may see things. So I think from our perspective at CDTC, I would say that it's looking at land and using a different language that isn't necessarily, doesn't necessarily always co-align with what's in either a management plan or a Forest Service plan or a Park Service plan for the lands or the acres that are involved within the CDT. And so I'll leave it there, but I mean, there's just so much to unpack in all of this conversation, because I think it's a way of reimagining conservation in a way that is breaking down this very arbitrary system. It's a system. So we're breaking down the system. And I think that starts with just basically how we talk about land and understanding that every single acre is sacred. And it's not just one place or one location in a particular park, but the entire thing has power and value and connections and holds the history of so many people. And then I'll stop.
I'll just say a couple of things, and yeah, ditto Teresa and Charlie, your opening comments are awesome. But yeah, just to quickly address this question, I think if we don't recognize sort of the relationship that Native people had to these places, I think it might set us up for this like total fallacy of thinking that humans are separate from nature. which is really a fallacy. Like it's not even correct. And I think if we go down that path of thinking that we're separate from these places and we don't recognize the connection that Native people have had and still continue to have to those places, that then we can't really value it. Like we can't really relate to it. We can't understand like at a deep level, like how much it actually means. Like for us as Native people, we don't see a separation between us and the water and the plants. Like those are our relatives. Those are all things that are sacred to us. And without like understanding that deep connection, I don't think there's a way for us to conserve it and to sustain it for the future, because it's almost like you're just removing yourself from those things. You can't really protect it, right? If you see it as part of yourself, I think that's the only way for us to start living sustainably on the planet.
I agree as well. And I wanted to share a quick story. I was speaking with a man that's a member of Quinault in the Pacific Northwest, and he was trying to explain to me his people's view of the land when we were talking about land management across National Park, Forest Service, all these other things that are the Olympic Peninsula. And he said, you know, this is family. This is our family, and you have to care for it like it is family, which is such an interesting and different view than what we're raised on, and could really have interesting implications for future management and collaboration and that sort of thing in the future. So I think, yeah, as Teresa and Sarah said, we need to reevaluate and maybe reframe.
Fantastic. I want to ask a follow-up question, but we have two related questions coming into, we have two related questions that have come into the question and answer. Both of them are about the path forward on the administrative side of things. There's been some acknowledgements made about shortcomings within the Wilderness Act, which is, you know, the foundation for administration of federal wilderness. There was in Alaska with the Settlement Claims Act and the Land Conservation Act. There was a revisit of some of those concepts and an alternative model developed. I think I have heard you all as panelists saying that more is needed, that issues remain, yet we recognize the practical challenges of legal sausage making and the Pandora's box, the opening of Pandora's box, the negative unintended consequences that can come. So what if you were to vision a future, recommend a way? Teresa, start. So I'm going to stop.
I'm like ready to go, and I'll just tell you why. Because first of all, legal language I hate because it's totally systemic, right? If you have to go to school for 6 years to understand how to write law, there's a reason it's set up that way. So let's just acknowledge that part. And then the second part is that, you know, why can't we just change it administratively? And we don't have to open up the law. I mean, opening up the law, yes, that's like black and white, and there's all the things that go in there. But I know as an as someone who works with federal agencies, managing a congressionally designated national scenic trail with legal, you know, direction and a comprehensive plan and everything, we just sort of go like, why not? Like, why can't we just do it? Like, yes, as long as it's, you know, why do we have to? That's a very systemic and very colonial way of approaching it. Well, we're going to have to change the law. No, you don't. Just change how you practice. And so when you are in the system, like, for example, I'll give an example. We have a section of the CDT we're still trying to complete down in southern New Mexico. It's interestingly enough, there are no recognized tribes, or I guess they're recognized, but there are no tribal lands. And these lands belong to the the Chiricahua, the Warm Spring, and Fort Sill Apaches. And, but they've never been consulted because they don't have any they're just now starting to come back to the Gila region. And, you know, there's no relationships between them really and the federal agencies that manage this land. So even if we did NEPA, they probably wouldn't be consulted anyways. So and they're not technically recognized, right? So then there's this whole other layer of how do you deal with that? And so we just said, well, why don't you just come out and we'll work with you. We're the nonprofit partner working in an interagency MOU with the federal agencies. Why can't we just invite you and hear what you have to say and adapt our plan with them in that way and elevate your voice in a way that it's not about us. So I think there's ways around the legal pieces, but you just have to free your mind and say, like, well, why not? Like, you just have to do it and think outside of the box. And that's the reimagination. And I think it's a very traditional way for us to just fall back on the law, either to not do it. Well, I don't want to change that because there's all these things. You're right, those things could happen. And so just ignore that part of it and challenge yourself to think outside of how can you do it just as human beings, relating to human beings, because you have a connection to the land and you want to do the right thing forward.
I just am wanting to hang out with this crew like for the rest of the afternoon. Teresa, I feel like you're setting me up for like every little comment that I want to make. This is crazy. But yeah, so I feel like, yeah, you should just have the just do it attitude. And sure, there are administration hurdles. And I have had to face this exact thing, I swear, in my whole career in the Forest Service, where like truly I'm trying to do research that is kind of breaking the rules to some degree, but it's put me in a point that it's a little risky. Like, to be honest, it feels tough. Like, it feels like you're the only one there. My alarm's going off because I have to go pick up my 4-year-old in a second. But I guess the point I wanted to say is, yeah, thinking creatively about these solutions is important, and we can find good innovation and good creativity in Indian country. Like, tribes constantly have to figure out unique ways to approach complex problems, right? They're awfully underfunded, understaffed. So tribes actually kind of have been able to navigate these complex situations. But I will say that it has been an awfully difficult challenge, kind of following my own moral, like, Indigenous code to research, but then also trying to, like, I guess going back to that bigger picture of like being a federal scientist, like, it's really challenging. So I'm glad that this was even a question that was posed, because those administrative challenges, I think, are really tough.
Sarah, so we appreciate the fact that you need to go pick up your child. We need to be integrated.
Sorry.
No. We need to be integrated as whole people. But before you go, I want to put you on the spot. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot a little bit more, but we're talking. The conversation got into involvement in management, and there's everything from cursory consultation through some spectrum of co-management to whatever the opposite end is, sort of the turning over of lands. As a federal liaison officer, do you have any concrete suggestions or recommendations that those of us who are working in this world can think about as we move forward, can try and put into practice, or things that you see all too often that really ought to be avoided?
I think all too often I see people think it's a quick fix, and like consultation is, a federal mandate. So that is a lengthy process, but it has to be followed. Any federal dollars that we spend cannot diminish tribal trust assets, resources, or values. So any dollar that we're spending in wilderness areas better not diminish those things. But so, yeah, I think all too often, of course, federal agencies and whoever else just see it as a checkbox when really it's not meant to be that. So I think that's my biggest frustration. But yeah, I think it comes back to the point I made in the opening statement about relationship building, just maintaining the good communication, having that trust and that respect, the humility, like all those things that I think we can bring to the table to just improve our relationships. And I'm so sorry to have to leave early, but thank you so much. And I'll let you all continue the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.
If I can also reinforce this, what Teresa said about laws, we also, like, not only are they inflexible, and incomprehensible to most people. But we haven't had the climate to do anything of the sort that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in a while. And I honestly don't see it happening in the near future. So yeah, just doing it is the most expedient answer and has the most flexibility, especially when you have co-management agreements. So you actually work with the local tribes, whether or not they're recognized, if you can reach out to them and get them involved, or MOUs, as are used in many places.
Yeah, I want to share too that, you know, it is a just do it. I mean, I'm also, we built an organization. We're pretty out there. We do it on purpose because it's just the way we need to be adaptable and flexible to the world that we're in today. You know, it isn't this, as you said, Shelly, it's not the 60s and 70s. We don't have the same climate. We don't have the same opportunities. I mean, look at Congress right now. And so I think we have to find innovative and creative ways to work within the system and find our champions. There are a lot of people in federal agencies. If they had a partner that they could partner with to actually find ways through using the system to actually do really great work, they're there. It's just a matter of being willing to say, like, and one, I think what Sarah said is being humble in these spaces and realize that at some point it's about power, right? Who has control of these lands? And if, like, I know from CDTC's perspective, we say a lot of times, like, that could, you know, we would love to see co-management of the CDT because it has such an incredibly, you know, long and amazing history with so many different types of communities, in particular Native peoples. And we've sort of said, like, what does that mean? Well, it could mean that we no longer are the lead national partner. Wouldn't that be cool if we actually weren't necessarily there at the table in the same way that we're at the table now, because we sort of sat back and we sort of provided support and weren't leading the effort. And I think that that takes a lot of courage to say, like, you know, what if we were different? What if we weren't in this traditional conservation model that we've always been in, especially for national trails? And what if we started talking more about the stolen nature of lands, and that there are these tribes that have these amazing, intense histories and connections to these places that we're simply not acknowledging. And yet we're supposed to be creating this national scenic trail for access and protecting resources and for this recreational experience. But how can you have this recreational experience if you don't even understand the connection to the land? And so there's so much there. And I just want to say, like, there's also always champions in the federal agencies and state agencies, and leveraging those partnerships is powerful. And it forces us all to be really creative and innovative. And I think that is where we are in this day and age in managing of all of our nation's lands and waters and trails and parks and forests, is we have to be innovative, because also the agencies take forever to do anything. They just do. Half the time they're understaffed and underfunded, and so you might have someone who has 6 different responsibilities, and you're asking them to do something really and become passionate about it, but they still have those 6 other responsibilities. And so I think it's a little bit of having compassion, humility, and but also being willing to just do the hard work and roll up the sleeves and think differently.
And just to add one last thing, having humility is one of the things that we're asked with wilderness. So it should be something that we're working on anyhow.
I like that point, Charlie. Thank you. So, Teresa, you encouraged us to think differently. One of the questions that's on my mind is what are the differences between the way wilderness looks and feels, or would look and feel, between its and I'm talking about capital W at this point, between its current framing within sort of the Western administrative structure versus how it would look and feel if it were managed in a decolonized and an indigenous way?
I think we'd spend a lot more time out in the woods looking at issues versus sitting in an office talking about how to fix them administratively. Honestly, we would go out and look and talk. And we're starting to work with some communities, and for many tribes, they still are collecting their medicinal plants from these places. And in many cases, in wilderness is the only place they exist. And so I think the difference is like how we actually look at how they serve both Indigenous communities, but also how they can serve non-Indigenous communities. You know, I was just talking to someone from the Warm Spring Apache, and they were saying, you know, it'd be really cool if there was no hunting in wilderness. How now that there's a radical idea. Could you imagine going to and I was just like, wow, can you imagine that conversation with, you know, backcountry, you know, hunters and anglers, if we said in capital W wilderness, there would be no hunting. I mean, that would just be crazy. But we should probably be having those conversations about what are those values and why is that? Or maybe there wouldn't be any cows. There would no longer be grazing of cows in wilderness. And they would treat differently some of the land management activities happening in there. You know, yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of space of understanding the relationship to, again, that from an Indigenous perspective, the relationship to land is so different than how we see relationship to land, because it is their relatives. Water, the animals, the trees, they are their relatives. And so how do you shift your way of thinking and management to recognize you're in a house with your family versus going to a place that you leave when you come home? And that's the difference, is what, as a colonized community, we go to wilderness and we come home. For Indigenous communities, that's always a part of it. They carry with them. And so I think management will look different because of that relationship. And we'd have to think differently about what kind of things we could maybe live with and without in wilderness. And also what kind of things could we live with in wilderness? For example, this conversation around, you know, many lands that are capital W wilderness before were heavily managed by Indigenous people. And so how do we think about that perspective, that some of these places did have a lot of management, and some of the issues they're facing right now is because, in terms of wilderness landscapes, is because they are not managed like they were traditionally. And that's one of those, I think that's a conundrum of what are we willing to accept as a wilderness community and what are we willing not to? And I think until we as a community can understand that, I think it makes it hard to have these conversations with Indigenous communities as well, because that's a really big rub, I think, in understanding that complex sort of connection and relationship.
Have you found, in trying to have those conversations, Teresa, have you had any moments of realization about ways to change your perspective, ways to change your words that have made those conversations better?
Well, so and I don't know, Tally, you probably have this too. Like, first of all, it means a lot of coffee. We drink a lot of coffee with a lot of tribes. And I think one of the things we need to start asking ourselves too is like, how do we define success? What is success actually? And I think it's not so much acres and these like widget kind of numbers. We have to define success differently in terms of relationship. Do you have a relationship where they know you by your first name and they invite you to, you know, a meeting or whatever? And so, you know, for me, I will just share that, you know, our work with both the Hickory and the Warm Springs has really involved a lot of just showing up and having coffee and sitting and listening for a lot of hours, and with no real agenda, just wanting to get to know one another. And that has led to some of these conversations where it is sort of like, you know, what would we be willing to give up? And so this case example of what's happening in this Mangus Valley area, which is not wilderness, but it could be, you know, it could be anywhere that there are Indigenous communities. But this idea of when we were discussing about a new location of the CDT, where, you know, the comment was, well, there's no archaeological sites that the archaeologists have identified. And this individual said, yes, but the whole place is sacred. And I was like, that's a really good point. So let's go out and look at this, and you tell us if this actually works for you. And then we'll adapt if we need to. And being willing to say, we're going to adapt this trail location if we need to, because it's sacred. And that could mean a lot of things. It could mean a really long reroute. It could mean a lot of craziness. It could also maybe mean, I don't know that this would be the case, it could also maybe mean that the trail doesn't get put there. And so I wonder, I think those are some of those conundrums. What are you really, when we go into these conversations with tribes, what are you really willing to do? Because if you're only willing to talk and talk the talk, but not actually put it into practice and deal with the uncomfortableness of how that's going to shift and change your operations, then you probably shouldn't even go into conversation. Because I think it's always going to be surface level. You're never actually going to have meaningful relationships with these kinds of communities. And so I think they're also long-term relationships. You don't just go in and say like, we're going to do X, Y, Z. And then when you're done with a project or done with a decision, you take off and you never talk to those folks again. These are ongoing relationships. And so if you're also not willing to invest in all of that unravels and unpacks as you get into relationship with tribes and Native peoples, then you probably also shouldn't do the work. And that, because I think that's the challenge, is our traditional way of managing lands and trails and wilderness and lands and trails within wilderness is really, we have to give up some power. That's the answer. Are you willing to give up power?
Yeah, and I with putting in the work like you talk about, I also want to point out that, you know, and that goes for all lands, like you talked about earlier. It's all one landscape. So it's not just wilderness land. So you can't put in the work in one piece of the land and then call it good. It has to be all of it. You have to have these conversations, and you have to, you know, maybe give up a little bit of power.
And so, Charlie, in your opening statements, you shared two examples with us, big picture. Within, and I hate to put people on the spot, but within your studies, have you found any? Do you have any specific examples of places, of moments and places and issues on which people did share power, on which this kind of change in thinking that Teresa is advocating for occurred, and progress was realized? Or are historical examples not the place to look for this? Should we be thinking more towards the future and outside of the box?
So those two examples aren't actually a part of my dissertation research. I want to just put that out there. I picked them because they're interesting examples. One example that I would give that shows hope but growing pains is, again, the Olympic Peninsula, where you have co-management agreements, but they were reached by years of litigation. There was, I think, 1 year where the tribes on the peninsula were in the court 300 times that year, which is multiple times a day for some days. And now, you know, it's interesting there because you have national park, you have national forest, you have wilderness, you have privately owned lands. You have all these people that still have some issues. The land management agencies still take issue with things that the local tribes do because they bring in like helicopters into wilderness to do some of their management actions, which they have the right to do because they are co-managers there. So while there's still some growing pains happening and still some issues to be worked out and decisions to be made on what everyone can agree is appropriate and not appropriate, maybe, there is kind of a way forward, and it's really interesting to watch. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We're about at the end of our time, and our friend Teresa's back. Excellent. As I was about to say, we're about at the end of our time. And I do want each of you to have an opportunity to put a bow on your thoughts, so to speak. There is one question in question and answer that has been there for a little bit that I would like to get to, and that is we've been talking a lot about administration wilderness. And I think we also need to recognize that everybody, like, we all have personal relationships with these places. You know, Teresa, you began by sharing what your morning was like. I know that there are times in my life when the weight of the world has been on my mind, and I have emerged from wilderness with clarity. And so if maybe bridging into any closing comments you'd like to make. You could also say a word about how we can bring together our individual relationships with wilderness and acknowledgement that at an administrative level there is need for some change in the framework. Callie unmuted first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, all of us have personal connections to these landscapes. We love these landscapes, and that's why we care so much. And bringing that love and caring to these discussions, I think, is really key. And something else I wanted to say in closing. So Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, in her book, An Indigenous People History of the United States, at the end is paraphrasing Jack Forbes while saying, while living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did, they are responsible for the society they live in, which is a product of that past, which I think is important to think about. And I think within this framework that we're talking about stewarding these lands and moving forward into the future in a more, hopefully collaborative way, what do we claim responsibility for, and how do we improve upon it for the future?
Yeah, I love that quote. That's such a great point. And I was going to say something very similar, which I'll just share is I think when we show up as being human and we're not showing up as just an academic or showing up as a land manager or showing up as an outdoor enthusiast or wilderness lover, when we show up as complete humans, as humans, I think we start to decolonize ourselves because we're not just staying within a system. So I encourage everyone to show up in these conversations as a human. Show up with the passion that you have for these places, the love you have for these places, and wanting to be in relationship together with not just everyone else who loves that particular place or the entire wilderness landscape as a whole, and creating space for voices that haven't had a chance to share, also as they show up as humans, and create a we, right? This isn't an us and them. This is really a we, and how do we move forward together? And there's going to be a lot of learning, and this is true of all this work in justice, equity, diversity, inclusivity. When we show up together in a human space, it gets a little messy, which makes it also complicated. It's because we're messy. I just encourage everyone to show up with compassion and grace, humility, and as a complete human, or as complete as you are, and create space for someone else to meet you in that same place, so that when we come up with those creative and innovative solutions, which I know are out there, we do that thinking mindfully of the traditional way of we've managed wilderness, as well as how we can move that needle forward. And then I will just put a plug in for the Wilderness Society's public lands curriculum. If there's anyone out there that hasn't flipped through that curriculum or hasn't taken a course or is considering like, what is that curriculum? It really helps decolonize and understand how we can maybe be looking not even just at wilderness, but all of our nation's lands, waters, trails, parks, forests, special places in a different way within the lens, and help you as like a person in this world to start thinking differently and reimagine what that can look, what wilderness, what conservation, what preservation, what all of these things can look like in the future. But yeah, just show up as a human and be willing to get to learn and grow in that process.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in a round of thanks and applause for our panelists. I am frantically Googling the Wilderness Society's public lands curriculum to put it in chat. I also put in there a plug for our friends at the George Wright Society, who have a special issue coming up looking for articles on Indigenous leadership in marine conservation. I feel like we've been focusing mostly on the terrestrial here. So these are ways that we can continue the conversation beyond this panel, beyond this workshop, which I hope we all do. So one more round of thanks for our panelists and the organizers of this workshop, and also especially for you all attending. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, thank you very much, Nathan and panelists. I'm not sure if Jeremy was going to step back in or not, but thank you very much. Very thoughtful, very thought-provoking session. In fact, I just had a thought that tomorrow morning, let me just share the screen here for a second. All right, so tomorrow agenda for Thursday, we did have a coffee break scheduled. Unfortunately, you've got a conflict at 11 Eastern time, but I will put a note in the feedback from tonight, or in the links for tomorrow, that I might be able to get the session, a coffee break session, scheduled at 11:30 Eastern time. If anybody would like to come and continue the conversation, we'll have an open forum for like the first half an hour before we move into the first session of the day. So I will see if I can't get that arranged, and we'll try to set that up. So if you want to come in at 11:30 tomorrow morning, we will have that open and continue this conversation. And then tomorrow we'll be talking off the start of the session. We'll be planning for the 60th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. That's coming up in only a few short years. And so then at 1:15, we have two sessions that are going to look at some technological aspects of wilderness management, discussion, philosophical and technical, about smartphones in wilderness, and then an app-based technique to conduct visitor wilderness surveys in Yosemite. At 2:30 Eastern time, we have the Bridge Project coming to talk about their hiring, innovative hiring practices that can be used. They've been very successful in the Southeast using this project as a way to reach out to diverse and inclusive populations and to bring new folks into the conservation movement. And then at 4 o'clock, we're going to have another topic dealing with Indigenous folks, and that's about researching the history of place with attention to both Indigenous and Afro communities. And we have Christy Hyman, a consultant, who's going to help us understand what we can do to better do our land acknowledgements and better understand the places that we're working at and the history of those places. Because I think that's an important part of us being better managers, is understanding the history of our place. So with that, we will close off for tonight, and we will see you back here tomorrow morning at 9:30 Eastern time, or not, sorry, that's not right. Anyways, we'll see you back here at 11:30 Eastern time if you'd like to be part of the coffee hour to continue the conversation from today. Otherwise, we will see you at 12 Eastern time for our first session of the day. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. And we will sign off here